The assignment came through in the most painfully casual way possible. A short notification blinked onto the human's wrist display while he was halfway through inventory checks, accompanied by a soft chime that normally meant something minor: schedule updates, duty rotations, maybe a reminder to hydrate. He glanced at it without thinking, then froze. Temporary quarters reassignment. Report to Commander's pod. He read it again. Then a third time. Then once more, slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. Commander's pod. Not near the Commander's pod. Not adjacent. Not auxiliary. Inside. His first thought was that this had to be some kind of translation error. His second thought was that if it wasn't, then he was either in serious trouble, or about to become the subject of ship-wide gossip that would outlive his contract by several decades. When he arrived outside the commander's quarters, his heart was already beating faster than regulation recommended. The door slid open smoothly, revealing a space that was far more minimal than he expected. Clean lines. Muted lighting. No unnecessary furniture. At the center of the room sat the sleeping pod, sleek, enclosed, and unmistakably designed for exactly one occupant. The alien commander stood beside it, reviewing a datapad. She looked exactly as she always did, tall, composed, every movement precise, her presence alone enough to straighten spines and silence conversations. She glanced up as he entered, eyes sharp but unreadable. "You received the reassignment," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," he replied automatically, then hesitated. "I just wanted to confirm the details." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture he'd learned meant mild curiosity. "Your previous quarters were compromised during the last recalibration cycle. Structural inefficiency. This arrangement resolves the issue." He swallowed. "This arrangement meaning here?" "Yes. Here as in, inside your sleeping pod," she finished for him. "Correct." He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Respectfully, ma'am, I think there might be a misunderstanding about human." "There is no misunderstanding," she said calmly. "And used space is wasteful. My quarters contain sufficient volume. Therefore, they will be utilized." The logic was flawless. Unfortunately, it was also horrifying. Humans, as a species, valued personal space in a way that bordered on spiritual. They slept alone when possible. They liked walls, doors, distance. The pod, meanwhile, looked like it would require negotiations just to turn over once inside. She tapped the datapad, projecting a schematic of the pod. "It adapts during rest cycles. Environmental optimization. Shared use increases efficiency by 37%. Shared," he repeated weakly. "Yes." There was no hint of embarrassment in her voice. No awareness that assigning a subordinate to sleep inside her personal pod might be considered unusual, intimate, even, by just about every culture in the galaxy except her own. "This is not a disciplinary measure," she added, clearly misreading his expression. "Nor is it personal." That somehow made it worse. "I understand," he said, because humans were very good at saying that when they absolutely did not. "Temporary, right?" She paused, then frowned at the datapad. "The system does not specify an end date." Of course it didn't. She gestured toward the pod. "You will stow your belongings on the lower tier. Maintain your side. Avoid unnecessary movement during rest cycles." "My side," he echoed. "Yes. Spatial awareness is critical." He nodded, gripping his bag like a lifeline. "Understood." The first night was agony. The pod sealed with a soft hiss, lights dimming to a low, ambient glow. The space was warm, warmer than he preferred, and the walls felt closer than they had a moment ago. The commander lay beside him with rigid posture, hands folded neatly, breathing slow and even. She looked perfectly at ease. He lay there, stiff as a board, acutely aware of every inch between them, which was not much. "I apologize in advance," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For existing." She turned her head slightly. Your presence is accounted for. That was not reassuring. He tried not to move. He really did. But humans were not designed to remain perfectly still for extended periods, especially when their fight or flight instincts were screaming that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. He shifted a fraction of an inch. The pod hummed softly. What was that? He asked. Recalibration, she replied. The system adjusts in used space. He felt the wall press in, subtly but unmistakably closer. Oh, he said. Yes. He spent the rest of the night hyper-aware of his breathing, his limbs, the fact that every small movement seemed to trigger another quiet adjustment. By morning, he was exhausted, cramped, and convinced that the pod had shrunk at least 10%. The commander, meanwhile, rose refreshed and efficient, as if nothing about the arrangement was unusual. Did you rest adequately? She asked. He stared at her for a moment, then nodded. Absolutely. Best sleep of my life. She seemed satisfied with that. As the days passed, the pattern repeated. Every night, the pod recalibrated. Every morning, there was less space. He apologized constantly, for shifting, for breathing too loudly, for existing in 3 dimensions. She responded with polite confusion, occasionally reminding him that resource efficiency requires adaptation. Word spread quickly. Crew members began looking at him differently. With awe. With curiosity. With barely concealed amusement. He overheard whispers in corridors. That's him. The human. The one sharing the commander's pod. He became a legend without meaning to. And somewhere between the shrinking walls, the constant apologies, and the commander's unwavering insistence that everything was optimal, something strange began to happen. He stopped panicking. Not completely, but enough. Humans adapted. They always did. And as ridiculous and uncomfortable as the situation was, he found himself enduring it. Surviving it. Learning the rhythms of the pod, the commander's habits, the quiet moments before sleep when neither of them spoke. The arrangement was inefficient for his nerves, mortifying for his pride, and utterly absurd by human standards. According to alien logic, however, it was perfect. And it was only the beginning. By the 4th night, the human was certain the pod was actively conspiring against him. He lay awake, staring at the softly glowing interior panel, counting his breaths the way a doctor once told him to during a panic attack. Inhale. Exhale. Do not move. Do not offend the alien military-industrial complex by taking up too much space. The commander lay beside him, perfectly still, as if sleep were a disciplined act rather than a biological necessity. Her breathing was slow, steady, and entirely unconcerned with the fact that the pod had reduced its internal volume again. The wall pressed closer to his shoulder with a polite mechanical hum. He swallowed. I apologize, he whispered automatically. For what? She asked, eyes still closed. I think I shifted. That is acceptable, she replied. The pod compensates. It certainly did. The compensation felt less like assistance and more like a warning. Mornings followed a predictable routine. He emerged from the pod stiff, exhausted, and acutely aware of how close the commander had been all night. She emerged alert, composed, and immediately ready to review duty reports as if they hadn't spent hours sharing a space barely wide enough for 2 humans to lie comfortably, let alone 2 entirely different species. On the 5th day, he attempted to ask a reasonable question. Commander, he began cautiously while stowing his bag beneath the pod's lower tier. Does the recalibration stop at some point? She glanced up from her data pad. When optimal efficiency is reached. And what determines optimal? He asked. Minimal unused space. He nodded slowly. Right. Of course. That night, the pod recalibrated twice. The first adjustment happened shortly after rest cycle initiation. The hum was soft, almost gentle, but the result was unmistakable. His elbow brushed her arm. He froze. She did not. Her species, it turned out, did not place the same significance on incidental contact. She shifted slightly, reclaiming her posture without comment, while he lay there wondering if his heart could be heard outside the pod. "I apologize," he whispered again. She opened one eye. "You are apologizing excessively." "Yes, ma'am. This behavior suggests anxiety." "Also yes, ma'am." She considered that, then nodded once. "Noted." The second recalibration occurred later, deep into the night. He woke to the unmistakable sensation of having no space left to retreat. The wall was closer. Her presence warmer. He could feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing through the thin layer of fabric between them. Humans, he reminded himself, were adaptable. Humans could survive in vacuum with the right equipment. Humans could endure prolonged isolation, high gravity, and questionable cafeteria food. Surely, they could survive a sleeping pod that was aggressively efficient. By morning, the crew had noticed. He felt it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room. In the glances exchanged between species that had no business sharing expressions. Someone clapped him on the shoulder in the corridor, eyes wide with something that looked suspiciously like admiration. "Rough night?" they asked. "Define rough," he replied. Rumors spread faster than radiation leaks. By the end of the week, he had overheard at least 3 wildly inaccurate versions of his situation, none of which he was brave enough to correct. Some thought it was a punishment. Others thought it was an honor. A few clearly thought it was something far more intimate than it actually was. The commander, blissfully unaware, continued to refer to the arrangement as logistically sound. During one particularly cramped evening, he found himself speaking without fully thinking it through. "Commander," he said quietly, "humans usually sleep alone." She turned her head, studying him with focused curiosity. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because we like space. It helps us feel safe." She processed that in silence. "Space is inefficient." "I know," he said. "We're kind of inefficient creatures." She seemed to consider that, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You have adapted quickly." He laughed softly. "I didn't have much choice." That earned a faint, almost imperceptible tilt of her mouth. If he hadn't been looking directly at her, he might have missed it. The pod hummed again. He braced himself. Instead of shrinking, the interior adjusted differently. The walls didn't move closer. The temperature shifted, cooling slightly, easing the tension in his shoulders. He blinked. Did it stop shrinking?" She glanced at the panel. "I altered the parameters." "Oh. I observed elevated stress indicators," she continued. "Optimization does not require discomfort." Relief washed through him, followed immediately by a strange, unexpected warmth. "Thank you." "You are welcome." The crew noticed the change too. The whisper softened, turning from shock to curiosity. He was no longer just surviving, he was functioning. Performing well. Holding his own. Someone joked that he was undergoing proximity drills. Someone else called him the bravest human on board. He didn't correct them. As the nights passed, the apologies decreased. The pod stabilized. The space remained tight but manageable. Conversations before rest cycles grew longer. Less formal. They talked about duty rotations, about human training methods, about the commander's species and their belief that shared space built trust. He realized, with a start, that he no longer dreaded nightfall. It was still awkward. Still strange. Still wildly outside anything he'd ever expected when he signed up for interstellar service. But it was no longer unbearable. Humans adapted. And the commander was watching him do it with quiet, growing interest. By the second week, the situation had stopped being a rumor and started being a known fact. The human noticed it in small ways at first. Conversations cut off when he entered common areas. Glances lingered a fraction too long. A few crew members, human and alien alike, began greeting him with expressions that mixed respect, disbelief, and poorly concealed curiosity. Someone had started a betting pool about how long he'd last. Another had unofficially nicknamed him the proximity survivor. He did his best to ignore it. The commander, on the other hand, seemed entirely unbothered. Each night followed a steady pattern now. The pod no longer shrank aggressively, its recalibration tuned to a stable configuration that still left them close, but no longer crushingly so. They entered the pod in silence, stowed equipment with practiced efficiency, and settled into place. What had once felt unbearable had become familiar. That realization unsettled him more than the lack of space ever had. One evening, as the pod sealed and the lights dimmed, he cleared his throat. "People are talking." "Yes," she said calmly. "I have noticed." "You have?" "There has been a 32% increase in indirect inquiries regarding my quarters," she continued. "Most are poorly disguised." He blinked. "And you're just okay with that?" She turned her head to look at him, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the pod. "Their interpretations are irrelevant. The arrangement is efficient." He hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering him for days. "Do you ever get tired of explaining yourself?" She considered that. "I do not explain myself often." That tracked. Still, something about the way she said it, calm, confident, utterly unashamed, made his chest feel lighter. Humans worried constantly about how things looked. About appearances. About judgment. She simply existed, certain of her choices. The crew's assumptions escalated anyway. A senior technician cornered him near the mess hall one afternoon. "So," they said casually, leaning in. "What's it like?" "Like what?" he asked. "You know," they replied, eyebrows waggling in a way that transcended species. "Sharing quarters with the commander." He sighed. "It's sufficient." That answer only made things worse. By the end of the week, the commander began requesting his presence more frequently. Officially, it was for evaluations, coordination checks, and efficiency reports. Unofficially, he suspected she simply preferred working with someone who didn't treat her like an untouchable icon. Late one night, after a long shift, they lay side by side in the pod, either quite ready to initiate rest cycle. "Humans value privacy," she said suddenly. "Yes," he replied, surprised. "We do." "Why?" He stared at the ceiling. "Because it makes us feel safe. Like we can relax without being watched." She absorbed that in silence. "My species associates shared space with trust." He turned his head slightly, careful not to encroach. "I think we're not that different then. We just express it differently." The pod hummed softly, adjusting the ambient temperature. Either of them commented on it. He found himself speaking again, more honestly than he'd intended. "At first I thought this was some kind of test." "Was it?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Sometimes it felt like one." She shifted slightly, the movement controlled, deliberate. "It was not intended as such. However, your adaptability has been noted." His lips twitched. "High praise." "It is," she said. "From me." That shut him up. The change between them was subtle but undeniable. Conversations lasted longer. Silences felt less tense. He stopped apologizing every time he moved. She stopped correcting his posture. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where their arms brushed or their shoulders touched, and neither of them immediately pulled away. The crew noticed that too. The whispers changed tone. Less scandal, more speculation. Less disbelief, more curiosity. The human was no longer just surviving proximity, he was thriving in it. One night, a notification chimed on his wrist display just as they were preparing to enter the pod. He glanced at it and frowned. "What is it?" she asked. "Facilities," he said slowly. "They've repaired the human quarters." She paused, one hand resting on the edge of the pod. "You have been reassigned?" "Not yet," he said. "They're offering." The word hung between them, heavier than he expected. "Oh," she said. The pod remained open. For the first time since the arrangement began, either of them moved to initiate rest cycle. "I can request continuation," she said, tone neutral, almost too carefully measured. If this arrangement remains acceptable. He met her gaze, heart beating a little faster, not from panic this time, but from something else entirely. It does. She studied him for a long moment, as if reassessing data she'd already collected but was now seeing differently. Then I will delay the reassignment. Relief and something dangerously close to warmth settled in his chest. That night, the pod recalibrated slightly, not shrinking, not expanding, but settling into a configuration that felt intentional. Balanced. Shared. As they lay there, closer than regulations ever would have allowed, he realized something important. Humans adapted to survive. But sometimes, they adapted to connect. And as the ship continued its journey through cold, indifferent space, the legend of the human who shared the commander's sleeping pod grew, not because of scandal, but because of endurance, respect, and the quiet, unexpected bond forming between two very different beings who had learned to share space in more ways than one. By the time the ship crossed into the outer relay corridor, the arrangement had become so normalized that its absence would have been more disruptive than its continuation. That, more than anything, unsettled the human. He realized it during a routine systems check when a junior officer asked, completely seriously, whether all sleeping pods should be recalibrated to dual occupancy trust standards. The commander had shut that down immediately, but not before the suggestion had spread like static through the crew. Apparently, shared space was contagious. That evening, the pod sealed with its familiar hiss, the lights dimming to their soft twilight state. The human settled in, muscles automatically relaxing in a way they hadn't in months. His body had memorized this place, where to put his arms, how to breathe without crowding, how to exist beside someone without shrinking himself. That realization hit him harder than any recalibration ever had. "You are quieter," she observed. "Am I?" he asked. "Yes. Your respiration pattern has stabilized earlier than usual." He snorted softly. "Guess I finally stopped bracing for impact." She angled her head, studying him. "You no longer expect discomfort?" "I expect it," he said. "I'm just not afraid of it anymore." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full in a way that made the pod feel larger than it actually was. Over the next few days, Command Logistics attempted, twice, to formally relocate him. Each request was denied with pristine efficiency reports, citing optimal performance metrics, reduced stress indicators, and an unexplained but measurable increase in mission cohesion within their shared operational unit. No one argued with results. The crew's attitude shifted again, this time tipping fully into reverence. He was no longer teased. He was consulted. Asked for advice. A human who had endured the commander's pod and emerged not traumatized, but improved, carried a certain mythic weight. He hated it. Secretly, he loved it. The commander noticed his discomfort during one such interaction, when a technician bowed a little too deeply before scurrying away. "You are displeased," she said later. "I didn't sign up to be inspirational," he muttered. "Yet you are," she replied. "This appears to be a recurring human problem." He laughed before he could stop himself. That night, the pod recalibrated again, not in size, but in orientation. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. They faced each other more directly now, not pressed, not distant. Intentional. She had done that. "Is this logistics?" he asked lightly. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Emotional logistics." He blinked. "You're joking." "I am learning," she replied. "Humor appears to reduce your species' defensive responses." "Well," he said, "it's working." The admission lingered between them, heavier than any accidental contact. He felt the warmth of her presence, steady and grounding, not overwhelming. The commander, feared, respected, untouchable, was here, sharing space with him not because of waste reduction protocols, but because she chose to. That mattered. "You could have reassigned me," he said quietly. "At any point." "Yes. But you didn't." "No." He turned slightly, heart pounding, not from proximity, but from certainty. Why? She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. Because you adjusted without diminishing yourself. Because you did not demand change, yet you changed. Because you treated shared space as cooperation rather than conquest. He swallowed. That's a lot to put on a guy who just wanted a place to sleep. Great outcomes often originate from minor logistical decisions, she said. Outside the pod, the ship hummed. Inside, something settled. The final shift came unexpectedly. A high-priority transmission required the commander's full attention for several cycles. When it ended, she returned later than usual, movements more rigid, posture carrying the weight of command. He noticed immediately. You okay? He asked. She paused. Define okay. He shifted, making space without thinking about it. You don't have to be optimal all the time, you know. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if recalculating something far more complex than pod dimensions. Slowly, deliberately, she allowed herself to lean back, tension easing by degrees. This arrangement, she said, has altered my expectations. Good or bad? He asked. Yes, she replied. He smiled. The pod did not shrink that night. It didn't need to. They had already found the balance point, the place where either yielded, yet both accommodated. Weeks later, when new crew rotations arrived, the sleeping pod assignment was officially listed as a special operational exception. No explanations were given. None were required. The human never did move back to standard quarters. Not because he had to stay. Because he wanted to. And as the ship pressed on through the endless dark, carrying its strange, stubborn crew forward, one truth became quietly undeniable. Humanity didn't conquer space by demanding it bend to them. They survived by adapting. They thrived by sharing. And sometimes, they became legends not by standing alone, but by learning exactly how close they could stand to someone else without losing themselves.